scripture for the message is from Luke 6, verse 43 through 49. Jesus says, "No good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. But each tree is known by its own fruit. Figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor grapes picked from a bramble bush. The good person, out of the good treasure of his heart, produces good. The evil person, out of the evil treasure, produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, his mouth speaks. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I will show you what he's like. He's like a man building a house who dug deep, laid the foundation on the rock, and when the flood arose, the stream broke against that house and could not shake it, because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not do my words is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the stream broke against it, immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great." May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. A disciple who hears Jesus' words and doesn't do them is like a man who sees himself in a mirror, turns away, and then immediately forgets what he looks like. So says James in his letter, which we heard in our call to worship. No one will become a disciple through our actions if we merely hear or talk about Jesus' words. It's only when we do and obey Jesus' words that a witness for him can be truly made. What good does it do, for example, to hear and talk about forgiveness when we are unforgiving? Or to hear and talk about generosity when we're stingy? To hear and talk about kindness when we're harsh? To hear and talk about being selfless when we're self-centered? We're not Jesus' disciples until we act in accordance with his words. That's what our text, I think, lifts up for us as Jesus is finishing his sermon on the plain here in Luke, and he talks about this image of a tree. A tree is known by its fruits. Sometimes the trees can look fine on the outside, and you can't tell until you see the fruit that's being produced whether the tree is actually dying and rotten on the inside or whether it's good on the inside. A good tree produces good fruits, Jesus says. A rotten tree produces rotten fruits. And then he applies all this and says, "For from the abundance of the heart, the person's mouth speaks." If there's good inside the heart, the actions of that person, the fruit, will be good. If there's evil inside a person's heart, the fruit or actions of that person will be evil. He then tells a parable about people who would just say, call him Lord, Lord, but not do what he says. He says if we hear him and do what his words say, that's like a man building his house upon a solid foundation. And when the floods come, they withstand those floods, that house does. But a person who merely hears Jesus' words and doesn't act on them in any way would be like a man building a house without a foundation. The stream or the river rushes against that house and it collapses, and its ruin is great. So just calling Jesus Lord is not enough. We're not his disciples until we act on his words. And we need Jesus' help to do that. And so we call upon him and ask him to help make us into good disciples. Let's hear how this was the case with Dorinda Axne, if I pronounced her last name right. She thought of herself as a Christian, a good disciple, She was blessed with a good family. She could do many good works in the community, but an intense spiritual experience happened to her during a surgery one time in her life, and it seemed to teach her otherwise. She said before the surgery, she felt dizziness and mild leg tremors for weeks, but didn't think about it too seriously. She had had a horse, and she was out riding on the horse, and it almost threw her one time. That gave her a whiplash in her neck, and said that caused symptoms to worsen. She had severe headaches, and she lacked strength in her legs to where she couldn't even walk at times. So, of course, they had to go to the doctor and do lots more tests, and when they did, they discovered a tumor behind her right eye, so in a very difficult place to operate, and surgery was going to have to be for 8 hours. Well, during that surgery, Dorinda had an unusual spiritual experience. She seemed to wake up in the middle of the surgery, at least in some sense. A strong wind, she felt, blew her into a dark tunnel. And yet, even as this event was happening, she could somehow hear in a distance the surgeon talking. And so she could say to herself, I must be under. And this isn't real, but it certainly feels real to me at the time. Different images would appear to her in this tunnel. In one of them, she said a phone was in her hand, and she was hearing a familiar voice on the phone. She started to have accusations, and then there was yelling, and then there was fighting. And then it seemed as if the phone blew out of her hand. And she heard another voice, again a familiar one. This time it was her brother. And he seemed to be saying to her, you have so much anger towards him, Dorinda. It's causing you so much pain. I keep praying something will happen so you can let it go. Impossible, she thought. There's no forgiving what he did. And as soon as she thought that dark tunnel suddenly burst into red-orange flames. She could even feel the heat from those flames. She said she saw a face in the middle of the flames. It was herself at the age of 9. Her dad had just told her that her mother was dead. She had suffered from postpartum depression on the birth of her younger brother, and back in those days she was sent to a mental hospital, and they did shock treatments with way too much voltage in the shocking, and the mother had eventually committed suicide. Dorinda could feel this tightening all of a sudden and then loosening upon her legs. And she thought to herself, that's the compression stockings they make you wear during surgery so you don't get blood clots in your legs. So I must still be in surgery. And yet this all seemed so real. The fire was getting hotter. Another image came up. Your new mother, her father says. She said she was a cruel and controlling woman, constant verbal abuse, and an occasional beating to reinforce the verbal commands that she had been giving. Dorinda escaped when she was 18 years old as soon as she could. I could never forgive Dad for what he put us through, no matter how he tried to reach out. And yet she thought to herself, well, somehow my other brother, who was praying for me to change, he had to bear with this treatment longer than I did because he was younger, and how could he forgive and I not be able to forgive? She said the flames dissipated a bit, and the anger within her started to soften. Again, she felt herself being blown by a strong wind. She could hear a voice. Forgive him. He does not know what he does. She said this was not a command. It was not advice. It was a voice of absolute love, absolute honesty. I trusted the voice inherently. truth I'd always known. And instantly, as she trusted, she said all at once, a light flared from the darkness. It was wondrous, shimmering brighter at each moment. The light pulsed towards me and then through me, suffusing me with an indescribable peace. All of my anger and hatred were washed away. When Dorinda actually opened her physical eyes in the recovery room, her husband was there and asked her if she needed anything. She said, I need to call Dad. There's something I need to tell him. An intense experience. Jesus was present with her, changing her from being a hearer only to now being a doer of Jesus' words. May we not be content with merely hearing Jesus' words and calling him Lord, but may our hearts never rest until we also are doers of the word. Let us cry out to Jesus that he would help us so that we may become his true disciples.